Hey guys, Sam from West Meadow Rabbits here. I am putting in some automatic watering systems today, so I've got some videos out on that. But I also have to move some cages around, and I've had some questions on how I set up my cages. And I think this is a good chance to show you kind of how I do that, since I've got to move them anyways. So without further ado, let's get right into it. Okay, so right off the bat, there's a couple things to look at here. I apologize for the camera work. It's a little tight in here, but I think I should be able to get it across. Okay, so if you know my channel, you know I make most of my own cages, and the standard size I typically do for a cage that's going to have a doe and a litter in it is about 2 feet tall, 3 feet wide, which is this way, and then 2.5 feet deep. This is a little bit bigger than standard. Definitely in the height department, most cages are only 1.5 feet tall. I like to have the extra space above because rabbits do like to stand up in their cages and, you know, occasionally jump around and all that kind of stuff. So I like them to be able to display as many of their natural behaviors as possible. And they seem to appreciate the extra space, as you can see right there. And I don't like the idea of them having their ears bumping up against the top, but that's just me. You know, there's more than one way to skin a cat. And obviously I give them pretty liberal amounts of space because the litters can get pretty good size. So with a cage that big, you're well above what's industry standard. A couple advantages to that, like I said, the rabbits have more space, especially with the big litter. They're not going to get as dirty. They're going to have more room for activity. Now, from a commercial perspective, maybe that's not ideal because they're burning more calories, so that's less growth. But I think you make up for that with the welfare aspect. They're going to be happier, and happier rabbits are less prone to disease. They're not stressed, and that's going to make them more productive in the long run, so you make up for that. Also, from a welfare perspective, I think it's the right thing to do, and that gives you a couple advantages. Obviously, most people raising rabbits want to have a better product than an industrial produced animal, and welfare is an important aspect of that. And it also covers you, because if people want to say, and I get comments all the time about how cruel it is and my poor rabbits, these are not upset rabbits. You can see they're relaxed, they're just taking in the seed. A couple of them are grooming themselves and otherwise just hanging out. Got some rabbits lounging around back there, some guys drinking. This guy's just messing about. He's one of my herd bucks. Everybody's just chilling. So I think it's important to, try to make your rabbits as comfortable as possible. Anyways, without further ado, let's get into it. They're probably not going to appreciate my camera getting up there, but what can you do? So I use J-clips to attach the cages. It's a very simple tool. I have a video on what kind of wire I use and all that stuff, and one of these days when I have to make another one, I'll show you how I fully make it. But J-clips, bending the wire where I don't have to clip it, and then once I get the cages assembled, once I get the cages assembled, it's time to hang them up. So I use jack chain. It's very easy to use. You can open it up with pliers and then close it up again, which allows you to get this kind of, kind of hook them on. You can just hook them onto each other. And I loop it through the corner of the cage where it's at its strongest, and then I hang it from a 2x4. Same thing on this side. And I only do that on the front. So technically this cage can go up. Alright, I switched cages because I wanted to make it a little easier. It's cramped quarters in here. But again, it's the same principle. Now this is a much larger cage. It's a triplex, but it's the exact same principle. So I've got jack chain here and right here in the middle where I have 2x4s available. And that's holding the weight here. You can lean these cages forward, but it won't happen. And I have these tents, so they're not, the cages are not loose, so when the rabbits move around, they don't shake too much. That, I think, is really important. You don't want shaking cages, number one, because it's going to knock the water and the food everywhere. Number two, it can't be fun to live in a cage that's constantly shaking. So I keep these tents, so when I'm hanging the cages, I actually lift them slightly, hook it so that they're, ever so slightly angled backwards, so when I release it, the chain will have tension on it. Now behind all my cages, I have a piece of wood. I usually install a 2x4. If there's a flat surface, you could use that. But for me, it's just easier to get a consistent constructed layout, if you will, by throwing a 2x4 on whatever I'm using. Then I place screw hooks into the 2x4 like so. And then I hook the top of the cage, or usually the middle wire, rates onto the screw hook. So let me see if I can show you that. Now you can see the screw hook in there on that cage, but I think I have a better shot. So you can see down this 2x4 there is screw hooks holding the top of the cages. Now what this does is it takes most of the weight on the back of the cage, and again, I don't typically have on the bottom screw hooks. I do in these cages, but they're not actually bearing any weight, they're just a safety. These cages on this side of the run don't have screw hooks on the bottom because it's just not necessary. I put them over there just because that area gets a little wind and just to be safe. But basically the way this works is, since the cage is angled, leaning back ever so slightly, the screw hooks are taking the weight in the back there, the chain is tense on the front, and the cage doesn't move around. Now, hanging this kind of stuff really only takes like 10 to 15 minutes. And you're gonna see how I'm gonna do that in there in 1 sec. We're in my shed right now. It's pretty much the same principle with the cages I made. Slightly different hanging mechanism, but more or less the same, similar size cages. On this side, however, I have standard store-bought commercial cages, and they're just sitting on a couple pieces of wood running across here. Now, I did this only because of space constraints. The shed can't accommodate cages as deep as the ones I make, and I had these ones sitting around anyway, so from when I was raising chickens, so you might as well use them, is my philosophy. But what I'm going to do today is I'm going to be putting in some wood up there across the top, hanging them, and that should make it easier for my automatic water as well. So you'll get to see kind of how I would put cages in. Granted, they're not made by me, but it's a similar principle. Okay, so the first thing we're going to do is throw across our main beam that is going to be holding up the cages where the jack chain is hung from. I don't have to tell you how to screw in a piece of wood and make sure it's level. You do not need to use a 2x6. This is just what I had lying around. It's definitely overkill. This right here is a 2x3, and that's holding up 2 of my custom-made cages, which are larger than the cages I'm going to be hanging over here. And those easily support does with full litters. So again, this is just what I had lying around. A 2x4 is more than adequate for, an 8 to 10 foot span. And this is where we're going to hang the jack chain. Next up, right after this. Okay, so after hanging our beam, the next step is going to be to put screw hooks into these 2x4s right here. Now, the smart way to do this would probably be to stick a 2x4, or in this case, you definitely don't need a 2x4. You could do a 2x3 if you had it, across, give you a nice, easy surface to screw in. I'm going to see if I have one. If I don't, I'm just going to go right into these. Again, I'm not too worried because these cages are pretty small. But if you were doing this from scratch and you had the stuff, definitely do it the right way here. So you're going to be hanging your main beam where your jack chain is going to be coming from. And again, that's okay for that to be a little back. You can, rig it that way. Or it can be directly above. Or like out in the pen, you can have it going this way and hanging them there. It doesn't really matter. And then the other part is you're putting your beam in the back where the top is going to be up against and the hooks are going to be taking the weight of the back of the cage. So let's get into that. Okay, so after you get your main jack chain hanging beam hung up, the next thing you want to do is pre-drill holes for your screw hooks. And you want to make sure these are as close to as level for each other as possible. So the easiest way I find to do that, short of really going hard and measuring out and drawing lines across, I found a seam right here on the plywood, which I know is straight, measured a couple inches up from that, and that's where I stuck each one. Now, you're going to want to pre-drill the holes for these screw hooks unless you want your life to be really miserable. If you're having a hard time getting these things in, you can use these. You're probably going to have to use something like this anyways, though, because we're technically not using these the way they're supposed to be used, and I'm going to have them go in a little deeper than, what you would typically use this kind of thing for. I'm going to basically put them all the way right up to the first bend where the hook starts to bend to form the hook shape. And that's because I want it to be as flush as possible with the back of the rabbit cage. So here, let me get that straightened out and I'll show you what I'm talking about. So as you can see right here, there's basically no space between where the hook starts to bend and the 2x4. So I get that as far in as possible, and you're going to see why I do that in a second. So you may need to use some pliers to kind of twist it in there. And guys, this probably goes without saying, and I'm sure it's pretty obvious, but I have no formal training in any of the trades. So if you've got a better way to do this, a more professional way to do this, by all means, do it. If you find out a better situation that works for you, innovate, mess around with this as much as you like. Definitely there are better ways to do this if you're starting from scratch. You can, try to keep it clean, keep it standardized. That's going to make this look better. It's going to be more functional. And I know, cutting corners and kind of eyeballing it can save you time in the short run, but in the long run, if you have a standardized, professional looking operation, it's going to look better to your customers, it's going to be easier for you, and it's going to save you time in the long run. So I always encourage you to do the best work you can. Another thing to keep in mind is you don't need to be doing this in an indoor structure. You could do this exact same design with a kind of outdoor hutch design, basically. You'd build a frame with your sloped roof, and then rather than putting wire, actually attaching it to the hutch and building like a hutch like I have outside at my duplex, you could basically just build the frame of a hutch with a roof, and then do this, make your own cages and just hang them. And you could do multiple layers by using sheet metal in between to guide the manure off. So this is totally applicable whether you're doing this in a gigantic barn, with a bunch down, a few, or a hutch, or any kind of combination in between. This method will work. So I'm going to finish off this last screw hook here, and then we'll get into actually hanging the cages. Okay, so the hardest and simplest part of this operation, and I know that's kind of a contradiction, is hanging up the cage. So as you can see, the strongest part of the cage is where the two different sheets of wire meet. So if you hung it on this, it's not the end of the world, but here you've got 2 versus 1 piece of wire, and this is the part that's actually J-clipped together, so it's just generally stronger. That's where I aim to hit this. And now you want it approximately centered, right, which actually is pretty close there. So just to repeat the motion, basically you find a gap in your tall pieces of wire, your 1x2 holes, and then you bring this down there, and you can see the wire is sitting in that little loop. And again, we want that loop as close as the wall as possible. And the reason we want that loop, like I was screwing those hooks in so much, is because the closer to the wall this is, the more snug this is going to be pulled against the back. And that is obviously better because that provides a more secure surface. Now, I am sure there's a more intelligent way to actually attach this to the thing so it's literally snug right against the back, and you may not even really need the jack chain, but this is just how I do it. Now, in this particular method, the main way we are going to be attaching this, and you can see right now, this baby's already floating, but I wouldn't put a rabbit in here because it's going to put too much strain on the back, and sooner or later it's going to fall off. So this is how I would get the hanging part done. Now we're going to hook up the jack chain, which is going to provide most of the strength, the weight, and it's going to keep us in a nice, stable, secure position. Now what I love about jack chain is it doesn't really need to be cut. You can just open it up using some pliers, or even your hands if you're really strong. But I bring wire cutters just to be safe. So now the first thing we're going to do here, I could open this up right now, which I'm not going to yet, and the reason is because I don't want it getting hooked on the cage, because this stuff is very grabby. Now we want it to be right to our corner as close as possible, so that way, as this thing pulls, if you've got it way over here, eventually this might slide and your chain might become loose. So I'm going to put it, basically, if you can make sure you can see that. So I want it, this line as straight as possible. I want it basically parallel to the line where the 2 pieces of wire meet on the side of the cage. Now there's a couple different ways to do this. The way I've been digging lately is I'm going to open this guy up. Use probably 2 hands so I don't get that in there. And it's that easy to bend it open. So what I'm going to do now, and this is the way I've been doing it, just the main reason I do it this way is because it saves chain, but basically gonna open it up a hair more. That's enough for 1 piece, but not 2 pieces of wire to get through. That should do it. And I never open this more than I have to because I don't want it to get all loosey-goosey on me. And there's going to be some fiddling here. So first you hook one end onto the actual 2 pieces of wire. And, you know, roughly, so you give yourself some play, I'm going to bend it right here and take it off so we can, you know, mess around with this, because you're going to see here in a sec we've got to probably make some adjustments. So I'm going to pretend like my jack chain's also on the other side and try to get this, let's say, right about there. And that's just temporary until I get the other side worked out, and then we'll fiddle with it and get it where it needs to go. So I'm repeating the process on the other side. Took that, yeah, I went around the bottom. Get a cage tag right here, so it's probably going to be in this spot. And again, if this is something you don't want to do by hand, there are tools for this, and you could also use a pair of pliers to hold this side that you're bending, so you could hold it. You can hold it right here with a pair of pliers and then use another pair of pliers to bend it. It's actually really easy. You'd be impressed. Anyways, so let's get this guy hooked on here. And now this is where the fiddling comes in. And I want both of these back ends to be sitting on the hook if I can. It's not the end of the world if that's not the case. Right now I'm just getting my measurement here so I can see what I gotta take off. We're gonna go ahead and do that. So I could hook it here just for now until I see exactly how I like this. Now this is where the art comes in. I left myself a little slack here so I could, that's too low. And basically all I'm doing is hooking it on to link. And like I said in my other video, I want tension and I want it to be relatively level. Now the cage is obviously not perfectly level either, but this kind of gives me an idea where I need to go, which is good. So I want to be, come on, lean back a hair. Well, this side's actually saying we're pretty level, which is good. So let's see what we can do here. Now, of course, we're not building a house here, so none of this has to be absolutely perfect. It's just as close as possible as we can get to level while keeping tension on the chains. That's the big thing. They need to be able to take most of the weight. That looks pretty good. Let's toss the rabbit in and see, well, not toss, but let's put the rabbit in and see how he likes it. So as we can see, he's doing all right. The cage is holding up very well, not too shaky. And you got to figure, with a New Zealand rabbit, you're looking at roughly 10 pounds of pressure consistently on here. So my chains are reasonably tensioned. If I ever think there's a problem, I can tighten them up. It's hanging here nice and easy. It's going to provide easier access underneath. No buildup. And again, this is a commercial cage, so it's got the drip pan here where you would normally stick it in. And the problem is when this is sitting on a piece of wood, manure builds up right there, so we won't have to deal with that. We've got more space. It's just generally nicer looking. And as an added benefit, in the next video, or one of the videos that I'm recording today, you'll see that's where my automatic water is going to go, which will provide a nice gravity feed option for this whole room. So now I'm just going to repeat this with the next bank, and I'll skip to that for you guys, skip the whole process. Okay, so I got our second cage hung up right here. Couple improvisations, since there was only one hook in the back. I had to screw in a couple tiny 2x4 blocks to stabilize it from going like this. But otherwise, the exact same principle. So about a half hour of work will get you 2 suspended cages. This would be quicker, like I said, if it was standardized. But in this particular situation, I had to adapt, and I was using what was handy. But if you really had this down to a formula, which I do for out there and for newer cages, you get this done pretty fast. So this is the name of the game, guys. I hope this was helpful for how I do my system. And again, this can be replicated pretty much anywhere with any materials that you happen to have on you. Gonna follow right into the next video. You'll see how I would put up an automatic watering system here. And yeah, that's it. So if you guys found this useful, be sure to like, share, and subscribe. Any questions you can ask in the comments. You can also check out my video on what specific wire I use for a little bit more in-depth detail about how I make these cages. And obviously one of these days when I need another cage, I will make a video on how I make it. Otherwise, thanks a lot, guys, and I'll see you in the next one.